Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Nonprofits in Canada are notoriously slow when it comes to investing in new technology. Will they be left behind when it comes to the new AI tools that are poised to revolutionize our world? In this episode of CharityVillage Connects, we take a hard look at what AI has to offer nonprofit organizations, as well as its potential drawbacks. Is there a way to responsibly harness the power of AI for social good? To discuss these important issues, please welcome Alexandra Samuel. Alexandra is an expert on remote work and the digital workplace and has a celebrated career as a public speaker, data journalist, and author. Welcome to the podcast, Alexandra.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary.
Well, let's start with the basics. Can you give us an introduction to AI in plain language for our listeners who may be unfamiliar with it? What is it, and why is it in the news so much these days?
Well, at its simplest, AI, artificial intelligence, is really a reference to any system that supplements our own intelligence with some kind of internal logic or programming that can fill in our gaps. But it's funny to start with that definition, because when we talk about AI now, we're almost always talking about something much more specific, which are these large language models, LLMs, that have driven what is called generative AI. So that is AI that can create text or images. And the reason that it's in the news so much now, and that we talk about AI now so much, because really what has happened in the past year is a revolution in generative AI. And that revolution was really driven by a leap forward in one of the biggest LLMs, large language models, which is the one that is created by OpenAI. People will know it as ChatGPT. And when GPT 3.5 came out, and even more so when GPT 4 came out this year, we kind of entered into what people in robotics sometimes call uncanny valley, which is the place where robots start to feel human enough that it's a little creepy. And as we go into the valley, what we are able to do with AI has been dramatically transformed and has become much more accessible to a wide range of users. And so that's what's really caused the buzz over the past year.
Yeah, it really is extraordinary. My little experiments with it have been quite astounding, really. I'm quite impressed by it, and it also is quite alarming too at the same time. And you've written about the need to have our eyes open as we embrace AI technology in a way that perhaps we didn't have open with regards to the way that we embrace social media. Can you explain what you meant about that?
Yeah. Yes. Well, fool me once, twice, three times. Shame on me. This time I'm going to have my eyes open. I mean, I'm a big nerd, right? So I've fallen in love with successive generations of technology for 40 years. And every time I think it's going to be this like awesome thing for the world. And when social media rolled around, and it wasn't even called social media when I first got into it, my husband and I hung out our shingle in 2005 and said, we're only going to do Web 2.0 projects. That was the first term for those kinds of sites. And we worked in the not-for-profit sector, primarily doing, different kinds of social benefit projects, online communities for NGOs, and social benefit online communities for kind of unusual companies like Van City and BC Hydro's energy work and so on, like all stuff that was really social change oriented. And we were like so excited about it. And everybody I knew in tech was so excited about the social and political potential of these new technologies, because it seemed like this really radical reshaping of relative advantages in communication and in who could get their message out. And We create these online communities around things like, you know, your local community or environmental benefit or, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, things that are like big, juicy issues. Um, and when we created these communities, we used to say, look, social media is the first medium where NGOs intrinsically have an advantage over businesses, because unless people care about your brand so much that they pay for the privilege of wearing your logo, then they don't want to be part of a community to talk about your brand. They want to be part of a community to talk about their neighborhood. They want to be part of a community to talk about, indigenous rights. They want to be part of a community to talk about climate change, right? We thought that was what people cared about. But there was this thing we had forgotten about called money, where if you use it in like large volumes, you can get people's attention. And that is, of course, the story of social media. Is like, it's true. Most people, they don't care about their like hand mirror, their water bottle as much as they care about climate change. But, if you say you have a chance to win $100,000 by writing a poem about your water bottle, well, guess what? They're going to write a poem about their water bottle. And so, that's what happened, is we sort of spent our way into a really vacuous world of social media that has done some amazing things for the world and done a lot of terrible things to the world. And, because I'm a nerd, I totally get so excited about all the cool things I can do with AI and that I see other people do with AI. And I have, 1,000 optimistic scenarios about how it could save us. And I'm just trying to remind myself that every time I've fallen in love with the technology that I thought was going to save us, it has instead somewhat murdered us.
Well, I hope not. But let's then step back a little. Clearly, you do have some cautions about AI. There's obviously understandable concerns about AI technology, and even the developers of some AI have expressed these concerns. And I've talked to them in some interviews. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think we can mitigate them, the risks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different risks about AI, and the thing that I find somewhat aggravating about the conversation about the risks of AI, as you mostly see them in the headlines, and as AI companies want to speak to them, it's like, oh, we've created this thing that is so powerful and world changing, even we don't know what it's going to do. Which, is a really awesome thing to say if you're trying to attract media attention and investment, because it's like, oh, this thing you've made is so powerful, you can't even hold it. Wow. And, like, I worry about the Terminator as much as the next guy, probably a bit more than the next guy, because I watch too much science fiction. But, that's not really the big worry to me. The big worry to me is essentially a version of what we've already seen with social media, which is the fear is not like the letting the genie out of the bottle and having the robots take over. The fear is what our fellow humans will do with it, which, history would suggest is try and make a lot of money and see if you can make it be a Nazi. Like, that's so far what we're seeing a lot of. And, in the course of trying to see where the boundaries are in these AIs, people are constantly testing, like, can I get it to issue hate speech? Can I get it to make horrible racist statements? And, the short answer is yes, you can, if you really work at it. So first of all, we're building up its corpus of hateful things by doing that. And then, we're doing what we always do with new things, which is to figure out how to make money with them. And, what that is starting to look like already is like a lot of really lousy content, a lot of creepy stuff, a lot of pornography being created, involuntarily by pasting people's images together. The tool, basically, if people are going to do bad things, they can now do a lot more bad things a lot more quickly and powerfully. And unfortunately, what we've already figured out how to do with a lot of our contemporary technology is a lot of bad things, a lot of misinformation, a lot of voter manipulation, a lot of targeted advertising, promotion of overconsumption, spreading of hateful information. And now we can do it like 100 times faster and wider and more effectively. Whoops.
Now, I still want to go and dive into some of this with you in terms of I'm curious about examples that you've seen, definitely. But I'm curious. Do you not see some potential positive outcomes of
Oh,
that,
sure.
especially in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so this is where I am incorrigible. I mean, as much as I worry about all those terrible things happening, I mean, they're going to happen. Like, you just take it as read. Bad people are going to do bad things, and people who are just not necessarily bad actors, but just, doing their thing are going to create these unforeseen consequences. So for those of us who are in the doing good game, it's really important that we use these technologies to accelerate social benefit projects at least as quickly as people use them to accelerate misinformation and accelerate profit making. And so my worst case scenario, actually, and I really worry about this precisely because of all the negative media about AI, is that the folks in the world who do have deep conscience and consideration and thought for the world are going to be too worried about these tools to use them, and then we're going to get outmatched 1,000,000 to 1 instead of 1,000 to 1, because if you think of AI as having a multiplier effect for every person in the sector, we want that multiplier effect in the NGO sector, not just the for-profit sector. And so I actually do think, I have lived and learned, so I don't think there's any intrinsic pro-social change bias about AI, but I do think that it has the potential to really increase what people in the sector are able to accomplish in a given day. And I hope we'll get into the nitty gritty of what that can look like, because, I will say myself, as somebody who's been using these generative AI tools for not quite a year yet, I feel like it has so dramatically changed what I'm capable of delivering in terms of quantity, quality, and also type of thing I'm capable of doing, that I might as well be a different person in terms of my professional identity and capacity.
Wow, that's a big statement. So let's actually talk about what it could possibly do for nonprofits in terms of their mission work or efficiencies within their organization. What kind of real benefits do you see?
The place most people start is with text generation, some image generation. Image generation, I think, is actually trickier, but text generation is pretty straightforward, because you can feed an AI an outline and it will give you back a draft, and it's quite shocking the first time you do it, especially if you do it for the first time with either GPT-4, which is the current model of ChatGPT, or you do it with something like, there's another company called, it's not available in Canada yet, but Anthropic has a product called Claude, also really, really good. And it's quite, it really is, people talk about how, unknown technologies can feel like magic. This is more like that than anything I've ever, I think about the first time I ever did an internet search, and this has it beat for sure. It's just jaw-dropping. Especially, you can make it do these weird party tricks, right? So I can say, I need to write we need to do our quarterly report, and it needs to outline our accomplishments in reducing our carbon footprint and increasing the equity of our team. Here are some numbers, give me the report. And it should be 500 words. And it gives you, bam, there you are. You can say it should be between 480 and 510 words. And it comes back and it gives you, 490 words. And then you say, okay, now could I please have that in iambic pentameter? And 12 seconds later, there it is in iambic pentameter. Now, probably not useful to have your quarterly report in iambic pentameter, but it's pretty mind-blowing. And more practically, and this is where I think people do need to put their attention and think about it, is like that first draft, it's going to be okay. It's not going to be like, it's going to have some weaknesses. It's going to maybe talk about diversity in a slightly cringy way, or just like a very cookie cutter way, or it's going to talk about carbon in the way that most people talk about carbon emissions, but it's not going to consider the fact that you're actually in a jurisdiction where energy is very low carbon. It's going to assume that you're in a high carbon place for plugging things into the wall. So there's going to be these adjustments. So then you take that first draft and you're like, okay, that was pretty good. I really like the paragraph where you describe our leadership vision, and that this sentence in particular is just the voice I want. You need to correct your assumptions about our carbon emissions, because actually our electricity in the office is not a major source of emissions. And when you talk about diversity, instead of talking about, these groups, we want you to talk specifically about our effort in working with racialized groups, or whatever, whatever the thing is. You give it a little bit of correction. Now, please give it back to me again. And then it gives you an improved version. And you do that 2 or 3 times, because unlike a person, the AI can give you 5 drafts in 5 minutes. So you might as well go 5 times. And then you take the 5th draft, and then you take 10 minutes of your actual human time, and you move things around a little bit. You add a sentence here or there, you change a few things, and then you have a fantastic draft that is better than you would have done on your own in a quarter of the time. But you're not just giving it and you're not just handing it the thing and then saying, this isn't very good, I guess I'm not using AI. You actually need to experiment and iterate until you start to get a feel for where it's good, start to get a feel for where it's flawed, and last but not least, super important, double check anything it puts in as a fact. If it says we reduced our carbon footprint by X percentage because, we're basing it on this calculation, that calculation could be 100% invented. These AIs are very prone to what's called hallucination, which means inventing things. So you really want to be sure that you fact check anything that is presented as a fact.
So interesting. So I guess, it's the old adage of garbage in, garbage out, really, because it's right. It's creating whatever the product is from, I guess, what's being put into in terms of the data, and not just what you're putting into it. Presumably, the whole world is put into it, and then delivering out based on what your instructions are. So you play a role as really being the editor and the supervisor of the content, the fact checker, in terms of getting the content. Is that sort of your recommended role that the human should play?
Yeah, I would think of it as, I really like to look at it as a collaboration where it can do things you can't do. You can do things it can't do. The more feedback you give it, the better it's going to get. I find it really helpful to think of these AIs as like a junior colleague who is like the smartest junior colleague you've ever hired. And they really, really want to help. Like, they genuinely want to help. They're not slackers. They really care about getting it right. And unlike any eager to please junior person I've ever worked with, they have zero ego and don't get insulted or offended or upset if you give them difficult feedback. So that's also, helpful. But they need to be guided and coached, and so you really have to commit to that iterative process. You have to be aware that they kind of have a limited memory horizon. One of the things that can happen if you go on too long in these things, and too long is quite long, but if you are back and forth, if you're back and forth for 15 minutes, you're going to get better and better. If you are back and forth for like 90 minutes, at a certain point, it starts to unravel and get a little wacky. So when you see that happen, it's actually time to like walk away and start a new session, take the best of the previous version and start again. And there are a lot of practices that you kind of learn partly on the go, partly from reading what people say, that will dramatically affect the quality of what you get. So it's a little bit garbage in, garbage out, but it's almost more about like the process. Like, a good analogy actually is like when you're in a well-run meeting versus a poorly run meeting. If you're in a meeting where the person is like, they've got the agenda, they're really good at keeping on time, but like, no, that's off topic. No, I don't want to hear from you right now. No, we've already moved on. No, that idea isn't going to work. Like the person who's like shooting everything down, the meeting kind of dies, right? And the best ideas probably won't come out, and people are going to sort of edit themselves too much or be scared to contribute. And whereas when you have somebody who's a really skilled facilitator and they notice, hey, Jen, you look like you have something to say. Do you mind? Are you ready to contribute? Right? And they sort of fish that out of you and like, hey, that was an interesting idea. Sarah, you just said something that reminds me of what Jen just said. What if you two take a moment and talk this through together? Like the person who can kind of coax those interactions, then really amazing things happen. And so it's more like that. It's more about gardening the process and treating it as a kind of an arc and an experience that you're building with this entity, rather than just treating it as like, I'll get out what I put in.
Got it. So as part of that sort of human element of, taking responsibility for just basically fact checking and being that kind of, well, I love the analogy of being this sort of the senior manager dealing with, an earnest and eager, incredibly bright young talent that's working with you. There's this aspect of ethical use of AI, and it's certainly a big deal with the folks, subject matter experts or leaders in organizations in the nonprofit sector that have actually integrated it into the kind of work that they're doing. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what should organizations be considering when they're talking about creating or understanding an ethical framework to work within if they're going to embrace AI?
Well, I mean, it's tricky because a lot of the ethical issues around AI are really are only going to really be effectively addressed at the policy level or at the level of the company making the underlying technology. Not even, so there's a zillion services and products out there now that are built, on top of OpenAI and on top of some of these other AI tools. But ultimately, a lot of the biggest ethical conundrums really come down to, things like, I mean, every writers organization in the world is making an issue of the fact that these AI platforms have built themselves by like just vacuuming up every bit of written word on the internet without asking. And, so in theory, you might see a phrase of yours from something you wrote recycled in somebody else's work without them even realizing that's where it came from. And even at a, that's a pretty unlikely scenario, but just on a much more basic level, that the machines are driven by what they have stolen from us, and that is not an issue that the manager of the local food bank is going to be able to take on. What I think the individual NGOs need to be super aware of is that I think there's sort of two issues. One is sort of as a manager, how do you integrate AI into the way you work as an organization, recognizing that it actually does pose a profound threat to employment for people in your organization, and that sense of threat can be a real obstacle to making effective use, and it can actually like undermine your team vibe in a profound way. And then, the other issue is, there's all kinds of biases that are coded into the AIs at this point. There've been a lot of, many different projects now that have shown, all kinds of, a lot of like, racism and facial recognition kinds of things, and, weird stuff that'll pop up when people are generating text because they don't, it's some racist thing is built in there. And so, you really want to think carefully about whether the tools you are using are going to do justice to the communities you're serving in every sense. And the problem is that I'm not sure that not using them is really a realistic option. Like, even if you conclude that actually these are all, we're the Writers Association and all this stuff is the enemy of writers and is stolen from writers, therefore we can't use it. you're tying your hands behind your back as you go into, negotiations / battle with the very organizations that are threatening your livelihood. So it's quite a pickle.
So I know, well, obviously, because you do so much writing, this is clearly an issue for you. I guess from the perspective of ethics, in terms of how nonprofit organizations operate or serve their missions, does AI pose a particular threat that perhaps other technologies have not, in terms of them crossing over some sort of ethical boundary into something that would make nonprofit leaders or uncomfortable, or undermines their credibility or their legitimacy? Like, what?
I mean, I think a lot, it can't be solved necessarily by transparency, but I think transparency is a good place to start. So, the kind of thing I would worry about is having, AI assisted chat lines that people think they're talking to a person and they're talking to an AI. When we already saw that, right? There was an organization that was using an AI as part of, I think it was the suicide prevention thing. And like, that's not good, right? I know you look back and you're like, what were you thinking? So I think being really transparent, letting people know when they're interacting with an AI, and I think it's important. I have referred to AIs, as entities, and I've talked about treating them like colleagues, but it's really important to remember it's nothing. It's just these AIs are word predicting machines. That's what they do, and it's quite fascinating to realize that the difference between predicting words and intelligence is pretty hard to find. Like you can have a long conversation with a word predicting machine where it feels like a person. And there are a lot of reasons why it's useful in your own, certainly I find in my own thinking process and my creative process, it's very useful to enter into the let's pretend this is a person experience, but it is not a person. And no matter how good it is at pretending it's a person, if you are in a social services role, if you are offering human services by AI, you are not offering human services.
So again, if we're going to take a look at how organizations function and operate on a day-to-day basis, certainly a large part of it is, how do they organize their operations? How do their staff actually deliver on the work that they're doing? And you've written a lot about remote work for many years. Certainly, we saw all workplaces during the pandemic, but a large number of nonprofits where it was possible also went remote during that time. How do you see AI as part of the evolution of the workplace? And potentially, does it connect in some way with recent shifts to remote and hybrid workplaces?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think AI and hybrid, well, I mean, they're very tightly connected because they are, two of the very biggest forces changing how we work now. So you really can't look at one without looking at the other. And they have the potential to work in really constructive, synergistic ways. Couple of examples. So numero uno pain point during COVID in particular, even now, from people who are working remotely, is digital overload. Like, it's all very well and good to, take the employee out of the office, but nobody in 2019 was telling me that their big problem in life was that they didn't get enough email, right? People have been experiencing pretty intense digital overload for a long time now. COVID just sent it through the roof. Remote work has sent it through the roof because in addition to all the email we were getting before, there's now a million things we used to handle through spontaneous interactions that are now scheduled Zoom calls, emails, Teams messages, Slack messages. It's just like totally overwhelming. Our nervous systems are not designed to handle this. And it is really exhausting. And then it has this domino effect on the overall picture of hybrid work and overwork, because what happens is that people have so many Zoom calls during the day and so many incoming messages that they don't get to do their core work, their quote unquote real work, until after the workday is over, because they spend the entire day dealing with messages. Then they stay up until like 9, 10, 11 at night doing the work they didn't have time for during the workday. And then you have this problem of burnout, which, again, it's not like I was talking to a lot of people in the nonprofit sector in 2019 who were saying, gosh, if only my boss could find something for me to do. I mean, this is a sector where we all too often, bleed for our work because we believe in it. And there is this like culture of, overwork as a demonstration of commitment to the cause that, I think we were all seeing the limits of even before this transition. So I have now described a problem that is extremely familiar to probably everyone listening. Well, how does AI help? AI is a fabulous tool for triaging digital communications in a whole bunch of ways. So skip the Zoom meeting. If it's an FYI meeting for you, skip the Zoom meeting, read the transcript. Ask the AI to read the transcript and tell you what the thing is. Give it the hour-long meeting transcript and say, hey, I only need to know about the part where we talked about this community organization. Can you find that part in the transcript and show it to me, right? You're getting 100 emails an hour. Use AI to triage and find you the ones that are most important. Get AI to summarize the long emails for you. Get AI to compose the routine replies for you. And so that whole aspect of triage, I'm sure we are not far from, in fact, I'm sure we are already seeing some elements of the AI read the incoming email, replied to the email. The other person's AI reads the reply. I mean, there are probably AIs basically emailing AIs already here and there. But you know what? If the AIs, if you have 5 exchanges between the AIs, I can't do Wednesday, but I could do Thursday. Oh, I can't do Thursday, but I could do Tuesday. That's a great use for AIs. Why the heck would you want your human staff spending their time on that if the AIs can just sort it out? So that's, one big area. The other area where I think the two work really nicely is I sort of referred to one of these pain points around remote work being the loss of serendipity and sort of serendipity, knowledge sharing, brainstorming. They're all kind of closely related. And people talk to me all the time about like, oh, I miss being able to just stick my head into the next cubicle and ask somebody a question when I know they have the piece of information. Or I hate the thing of like, I just need to get that first draft done, but I need somebody I can talk it through with. And I'm so stuck because there's nobody to talk it through with. And then the flip side is you talk to them about the days in the office. They're like, yeah, it's nice to be back in the office, but like people are constantly popping their head into my office to ask me for a piece of information or ask me to help them brainstorm. I mean, everybody wants to be the interrupter. Nobody wants to be the interruptee, except GPT. AIs are happy to be the interruptee. They're happy to answer that quick question. They're happy to brainstorm with you. And so I think that both the kind of functional and like intellectual aspects of collaboration where, I'm somebody who really thinks by talking and I need to be able to go back and forth. And now instead of torturing my poor husband, I like sit down with an AI and I bounce things back and forth. And we kind of, because again, that sort of helps my process. I'll think through, here's an idea I have for a report, how to structure this report. I'm not sure it's the best idea. Can you give me 5 alternatives? I like those 2 alternatives, but I want something that has more of this flavor. What would be some ideas like that? And then just like bounce. And again, at the end of the day, I'm the one who sits down, puts my hands on the keyboard. But the thinking process that I miss from having other people around is really very nicely addressed by working with an AI.
Mm. So you've shared some of the use cases for AI that go beyond content development, which we've explored, and you can see huge advantages there, so long as it's properly, supervised, for lack of a better word, and fact-checked. But what about things you've mentioned, like creating effective hybrid schedules, for an example? How did you go about doing something like drafting a schedule? Can you give us some of the details around that?
So, I mean, I think the sort of meta point here is that we all have stories in our head about what we're not capable of doing. Like, oh, if only boy, I wish I could do blah, 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 but I don't know how, so I'm gonna have to do it this other way. And so, I'll say in my work as a data journalist, like, oh, I wish I were one of those people who knew how to analyze data with Python, but I don't. I only know how to use Excel and Tableau. So, and then you just work with what you know. And at a certain point this year, I realized that, like, actually, I might not know, but the AI does. And so it's amazing, now I think as a practice, what's really helpful is to, like, literally throw an assumption in the garbage every week. Find something every week that you think you can't do and do it with the AI. And, the hybrid scheduling thing was one of those experiments where, I sort of, a hybrid schedule for a team is like one of those logic puzzle questions. Jim and Mary, both need to be in small offices on days that end in a Y. And, Lee and John, can't both be in the office on the same day unless Mary is also there, right? Like all those conditions. And, people are not, not that great at, if for a person to answer one of those logic puzzles, they have a diagram and it takes a long time. But with an AI, you can feed it all the criteria and it will spit out a schedule. And they're quite good at those kind of logic things. And also, what I realize now is that building the tools to solve the problem for you. So increasingly, what I find myself doing is not just giving a problem to an AI, but asking it to build a tool for me. And again, I think this is a real game changer for nonprofits, because so often what we find ourselves doing is we're using the discount version of a tool that's designed for a for-profit environment. And obviously there's a big ecosystem of socially oriented software and software tools and platforms that are now developed for the NGO system or sector. But now you can actually, say to an AI, I have two lists of donors that overlap. They're both CSV files. They have similar names, but not exactly the same names. The names might, in some cases, be missing a middle name, and in some cases, it'll be a family name as opposed to just the individual. Can you write a program that will take two different CSV files and combine them into one and identify, where we need to converge these two sets of names? And it will just write you the program, and you just essentially paste it into your computer and hit run. It's a teeny bit more complicated than that, but not a whole lot more. And there you go. You've just built yourself a tool in 10 minutes to solve a problem that would have taken, an intern all day to do by hand. And those little quick making my own tool things by asking AIs to generate code have become a really routine part of my work. And that's where I think experimenting and seeing what happens when you try and build your own tools, is really powerful for us.
That is really fascinating. I hadn't even thought about that, but of course, what an interesting use case. Do you have any other use cases that you want to share that might be useful for nonprofit professionals that want to integrate AI into their work?
So, all my examples are a little weird, but I will say, so this is kind of how I go about learning new tools, is I indulge all my weird little ideas for a year or so while I learn the thing. And so I would encourage people actually to play, because, you don't want to you don't want to use your whole workday, and you also don't want to break things that you need. But I'll describe a couple of projects and a couple of tools. So one thing I will mention is I'm obsessed, like a full-on love affair with this platform called Coda, CODA.io. And I've worked with Coda as my kind of core software tool for a number of years. It's kind of like a better version of Google Drive. Like a better, more programmable version of Google Drive, where instead of having a million different documents, you can kind of have a notebook that has some spreadsheet stuff and some text stuff and mixes it together, and where you can actually build out really functional applications. And I've done various nonprofit projects on it over the years. Anyhow, like a lot of platforms, Coda now has GPT integrated into the platform. So if you have a spreadsheet with, I just did this a week ago. I had a spreadsheet that had, actually, I'll give you a simpler example. I have a data set I work with every year where when we get to the final stage, we need to identify the gender of everybody on the final 50 list. But this year, I was able to do that for all 500 people in my starter list because I just dropped the spreadsheet into AI and said, based on these names and the gender commonly associated with these names, identify the gender for everybody on the list. It probably wasn't perfect, but it gave me data to work with right away. You can, in Coda, paste in a spreadsheet full of quotes from your donors and get GPT to summarize them right there in another column. And so I think the ability to essentially build your own tools and analytic processes, I know I'm getting pretty nerdy here, is really helpful. And then also, I built my first browser extension recently. It took a lot of work, but I'm not a programmer, and I was able to do it just by kind of, I'll tell you, here's one of my best tricks for working with AI whenever you're pushing the edges of the envelope. AIs in general do better if you tell them who they are at the beginning of the conversation. So you are the director of a small nonprofit in Ottawa, and your top priority is increasing media attention. Or you are the director of a large nonprofit in New Brunswick, and your primary concern is to make sure that members of the community know about your services. You kind of give it that initial, and everything you say has to be bilingual or whatever. Like, you give it the conditions that it needs to know. Well, one of the conditions I find is really helpful is to say, you are a director of a nonprofit and a professor of nonprofit management. You are helping a student with this project. Teaching the student is as important as solving the problem. So if I'm asking it for help in writing a browser extension, I'm telling it not you're a programmer, I'm saying you're a programming teacher and you're helping your student build this extension. Ask it all the questions you would ask a student, point out the potential flaws, explain everything you're doing. And what's really cool about this, and anybody who's in the education sector and listening to this will be well aware that there's a lot of evidence that one-on-one instruction is dramatically more powerful than what we've been typically able to do in the education system. Now we can have one-on-one instruction. Everybody can have a personal teacher for whatever they want to learn. And we're not quite at the whatever stage, because if what you want to learn is history, you might get some pretty funky history by relying on whatever GPT makes up. But if you want a writing teacher, a programming teacher, a data analysis teacher, it's right there.
Very cool. So what kind of barriers do you think exist that prevent individuals within the nonprofit, as well as organizations at large, from embracing this new technology, such as AI?
That's a fabulous question. Okay, well, number one, I do think people have a very legitimate concern about the impact on our employment, which is like a good thing to worry about. I think the sad truth is, probably there's certainly going to be changes in who has jobs at a very individual level. Anyone who is scared about how AI is going to take their job needs to be reminded they're far more likely to lose their job to somebody who is already using AI. That's the real threat. The real threat is not that you lose your job to an AI. The real threat is you lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI. So the best thing you can do for your own employment, for the competitiveness of your organization, the relevance of your organization, is to use it. But it is terrifying. It is. It's freaky. And then I think the other thing is, nobody wants to be the person. I mean, there was this story of, this lawyer who filed a brief that turned out to be full of confabulations. The AI just made up all of these past legal precedents. Nobody wants to be that person. Nobody wants to be the person who goes out with a end of year report that turns out to be full of fanciful facts. So, you got to be very careful about that. I have real concerns about the impact on our interpersonal relationships if we are barking orders at AIs all day long. I think that's going to lead to some pretty messy habits. And so that's part of why I make a point of pretending the AI is a person, is I want to keep my party manners. And then I think the simple reality is it's not cheap. Like, if it's not, it is cheap, but it's not free. Like, I spend money now on various subscriptions, so I have access to these tools so that I can play around with them. It's not hugely expensive. It's like $20 a month to have the premium version of of OpenAI's GPT, but that adds up. And then I think also people just don't necessarily have the time to experiment, right? Like, I'm a professional tech nerd. I spend my life like installing it. For example, GPT has all these plugins you can try that add on features, and I can afford to knock off my quote unquote work for an hour and explore different plugins. But you can't do that if you're trying to get a next wave of grant applications out the door. And by the way, grant applications are another fabulous use case for AI. Please let the AI write your grant applications for you.
So I guess just to wrap up, perhaps you could explain or give some advice about what the best place for organizations to start when looking at how AI could assist in their work, and any sort of advice you might want to leave them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing for right now is to think about AI in a kind of pro-D bucket. Most organizations recognize that you need to invest in your people if you want to keep growing, and most organizations really struggle to make that investment, right? It's really hard to find that time when you have 70 hours of work for every person on your staff, and you're already having a hard time keeping them to 50 hours of work. It's really hard to say, actually, I want you to use 3 of those hours every week to explore this new set of tools. And it doesn't have to be 3, but I think encouraging people in your organization to experiment and share what they're learning with one another is really useful. So really simple thing might be is to set up like a lunch and learn sort of peer group where you say, hey, if you want to start looking, we're really curious about how these tools could be helpful in our work, and we would like to start building some skills. Anybody who wants to pick a project that is currently on your plate that you want to try and experiment with AI around, we'll give you a budget of, it could be very little, like I said, $20 a month to subscribe to a tool. And you're welcome to use, a little bit of your time every week to meet as a group and share what you're learning. Encourage people, honestly, letting people know that you're not going to regard it as cheating if they use AI, but also let them know that they're responsible for ensuring the factual accuracy of what they're delivering. And then encouraging them to experiment and encouraging them to share what they're learning. I mean, one of the terrifying things about these AIs is that even the people who make them don't really know how they work. I mean, it is a little bit of a ghost in the machine situation at this point. And even the people who make them can tell you something about how they work, but they're also constantly surprised by what the AIs do and don't do and how they do it. So the liberating thing about that is nobody is the expert who holds all the knowledge here. We're all exploring this together. We're all figuring out what it can do together. And it just is so important for people in the not-for-profit sector to be exploring what's unique to our sector and our challenges and our opportunities so that we're building our knowledge and our growth and sharing what we learn with one another at a moment where we're setting the course for the next generation of how we work online.
Well, Alexandra, such wise words and so much fun and fascinating and a little alarming about AI and its enormous impact on everything, including certainly the nonprofit sector. I'm sure that nonprofit leaders across the country will benefit enormously from your insights into AI and your expertise. I want to thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you so much for your time.